Hello and welcome back to Live Positive Ministries. This is Pastor Jason, and I'm so glad to have you with me today. I was originally going to discuss something quite different in today's message, but as hopefully some of you will see, I had recently posted in the last episode about religious malpractice and how through faith, through religion, we could be inadvertently killing God through the inappropriate practice of faith and inappropriate practice of religion. And something came up that really disturbed me. I saw an article that had come up about how during Passover, Good Friday, a New York Times essayist wrote about killing God and that it's time to remove God from our lives. And of course, my last episode, which I had recorded about 10 days prior to this article coming out, was really just about that. It was about the fact that so many people in a modern world are moving away from God due to the inflexibilities of religion, due to mankind doing things in the name of God that are not godly. And due to the fact that so many people tie the belief in God or the acceptance of God into the practice of a specific religion and a specific faith. And this article I found very, very disturbing. Now, it depends on where you read everything. Not everything within the article is necessarily dark. I mean, this individual, his name is Shalom Auslander. He does, he closes everything with the fact that he wants peace in the world. And I get that, right? But much of what he says within this article is quite inflammatory. It's quite simplistic in the way that it approaches things. Many could often view this, and rightfully so, as a direct evil attack on God and the faithful, and brought upon by Satan and all that's evil in the world itself. And I certainly do understand that feeling. And quite honestly, it was my first initial reaction as well until I read the entire article. But that being said, it did highlight, unfortunately, the problem that the faithful face in today's world. Some of the quotes in the Fox News article, but I am going to go to the actual article by this individual. But quotes like, if in reference to God, quote, "If he were mortal, the God of Jews, Christians, and Muslims would be dragged to the Hague, and yet we praise him." Another quote was, "In this time of war and violence, of oppression and suffering, I propose we pass over something else, God." He describes that God as hateful, full of brutality. And, these are the very disturbing things, right? As a compassionate person, as a empath, as someone that wants to try to understand the motivations of somebody, and why they have come to where they come to, and try to see if there's a motive or reasoning that's not necessarily evil, but it's one of hurt or what have you, so that you can help heal that hurt. It's very hard to see these things, because this kind of idea, and everybody's free to express their ideas, but putting this out there in such a way, in such a major publication like the New York Times, especially on a very holy time for the spiritual and the faithful, there's a lot of impressionable minds out there that will listen to this, and it sounds, when you look at the biblical, and that's all this individual is doing, is using the Bible, using the teachings of the Jewish faith, the Judeo-Christian values, and just using those teachings against God, right? But they talk about Israel's ancient enemies were troubling, but he says just as troubling, and even more so today, in the light of brutal slaughter taking place in Ukraine, These are plagues themselves, and Egypt's young and old, innocent and guilty, suffered locusts and frogs, hail and darkness, beasts running wild, and water becoming blood. Surely, this is a quote from him, surely I wondered, there were some Egyptians who didn't whip Jesus, who didn't have anything against Jews at all. So he posits, God, it seems, paints with a wide brush. He paints with a roller in Egypt, and he even killed his firstborn. Yes, when you read these teachings, and this is part of the problem that I have with those of us who wish to minister and to others, is the understanding that so much within the Bible, and I'm kind of getting off track here, but this is pertinent to the conversation, it is either stories being told to help explain complex ideas to people that perhaps might have had a hard time understanding those complex ideas. Sometimes some of it was done to take stubborn people who are very set in their ways, put the proverbial fear of God into them to get them to comply and to get them to, treat people better, if not because of their own goodness, but just out of fear of what may happen to them if there are no repercussions. And that's the problem when you do these things, right? You may have done this with a good intention, although some people obviously use faith and religion for evil purposes, but many did it like, oh, well, we're going to kind of put this fear out here. And yes, it's not good necessarily to control people with fear, but if the end result pays off dividends, well, then it was worth it in the end. But anytime you build anything off of a lie, that lie can only stand for so long before the truth comes out. And I think that many of these, thoughts and ideas and theories about who and what God is and what God wants from us and what God's going to do to us if we don't follow him the appropriate way, that were added in there by man, by humanity, not by God, but by man. We are now reaping what we sowed. We are now paying the price. We are now putting people into a situation where they cannot accept God, because just like this individual says, if you want to view God as God of the Bible and God of the Jewish faith and God of so many, well, why would you, right? If there's such cruelty within this creator, and this creator is willing to do such awful things to people, and some people that maybe had nothing to do with anything, who may have had no problem with God or may have even been faithful themselves, well, this is where the fault lies in religions, okay? And so let me kind of get into this. So the title of the article was in the New York Times, and it's "In This Time of War, I Propose We Give Up God." It's an essay, an opinion essay, and I'll give it to him, but I mean, obviously the timing of this was meant to be inflammatory, and it was meant to, get people talking about it as it has. And it's written by, again, a gentleman, I believe, by the name of Shalom Auslander. And, again, he begins the article basically just talking about the holiday of Passover and the history of Passover. And primarily the two aspects of the Passover story that troubled him since he first learned of them in the Orthodox yeshiva in New York, where he was from when he was a young boy. And his rabbi would tell them to open up, I'm not sure if I'm saying this right because I'm not Jewish, I don't pronounce it, but Chumashim. It's the Old Testament to the book of Exodus. And as he quotes it, he told them of gruesome tales of torture and persecutions. Talks about how the Egyptians used the corpses of Jewish slaves in their buildings. And by saying that, they were putting the Jewish bodies into walls and using them as bricks. Obviously that's a troubling idea, to see that you have such a dismissal of humanity that way. But again, all right, as this gentleman discusses this, That's something humans did. It's not something God did, okay? And if they did it in the name of God, or they justify God in some way by doing these things, that's just their own justification for doing something that was just immoral and incorrect. It's not to be labeled onto God. It's not to be put onto God. God didn't do it, okay? And then he says, just as troubling, and even more so today in the light of brutal slaughter taking place in the Ukraine, which were plagues themselves, God, the rabbi said, struck all the Egyptians with his wrath, not just the Pharaoh and his soldiers. Egyptians, young and old, innocent and guilty, suffered locusts and frogs, hail and darkness, beasts running wild and water becoming blood. Mothers nursing their babies, the rabbi explained, found their breast milk had turned to blood. But the Pharaoh, the story continues, still wouldn't relinquish his slaves. Technically, this was God's fault, as he hardened Pharaoh's heart. But the issues of free will wouldn't begin troubling me until my teens, and so God in his mercy started killing babies. Every firstborn son in the land of Egypt shall die, from the firstborn of Pharaoh who sits on the throne to the firstborn of the servant girl, as in the Bible, Exodus 11:5. Again, this paints an awful, gruesome picture, right? So the point, and I'm not justifying, because I do not agree with the premise of this individual's article in any way. But again, when you look at these things, okay, these are attributed to God. And so when we give this kind of ammunition to people, they are able to paint our God as pretty horrific, pretty vengeful, pretty spiteful, pretty cruel. And yet these things were done by humans in the name of God, okay? These things that happened perhaps sometimes, if let's say a bunch of children died, we know how humanity, we look at it today in the modern world, and with social media, someone goes out there and says something on social media and people don't research it. It's just taken as fact. Well, here's an example, kind of goes even really before social media was huge, but back when Sarah Palin was running as vice president of the United States, and golly, I can't forget her name, but the Saturday Night Live, Tina Fey from Saturday Night Live does a skit picking on Sarah Palin because she was the governor of Alaska at the time, and says, I can see Russia from my house. And everybody, and there's still many people to this day that believe that Sarah Palin actually said that. Tina Fey herself has come out and said many times, I made it up. It was not a quote from Sarah Palin. It's just something I felt sounded like something she would say. And so somebody with mass influence and mass exposure says something that sounds believable, and to this day, even after the person that said it's not true, still believe and accept it as truth. And so it's not much different in a situation like this sort of thing. Perhaps there was some kind of sickness going through and a bunch of children died at that time. Well, many people, whether they be the rabbis, whether they be the priests, whoever it was, in this really rabbis and clerics and such, but attributed it to God. Oh, look, you all sinned, you've done bad, and now God has struck your children down and has killed your children. And that's how the explanation, came to be. Who knows what actually brought these stories upon people? Who knows how it actually played out? But the reality of it is, yes, it sounds horrible. It sounds awful. But again, I would contest this was not God's doing. At least not as we understand it, or not as it's explained in these stories that are told in the Bible. And he continued after that quote from Exodus 11:5. It says, surely I wondered, there were some Egyptians who didn't whip Jews, who didn't have anything against Jews at all. Surely there were Egyptians horrified by slavery, Egyptians who disagreed with Pharaoh as often as we do with our own leaders. Everyone, I asked the rabbi. He struck everyone? Everyone, the rabbi said. Yea, my classmates cheered. God, it seems, paints with a wide brush. He paints with a roller in Egypt, said our rabbi. He even killed firstborn cattle. He killed cows. If he were mortal, the God of Jews, Christians, and Muslims would be dragged to the Hague, and yet we praise him, we emulate him, we implore our children to be like him. Again, this kind of ties back into my story with my teacher when I was in Lutheran school. And this is my previous episode. I'm not going to go through the whole story again, but I had a very similar conversation with her as a child, not understanding how somebody who had no way of ever knowing of Jesus Christ could be condemned to an eternity of hell when they literally had no way of ever knowing that Christ existed. It's the same kind of inflexibility, malpractice of faith that is telling people these things. No, this is the rabbi's opinions and beliefs as he has been taught by others before him, that these things happen because of God. Okay? And so now it's being used as a justification, and it's going to be used as a justification that we stop emulating, in his quotes, this hateful God. He says, perhaps now, this is again quotes from the article, perhaps now as missiles rain down and the dead are discovered in mass graves, is a good time to stop emulating this hateful God. Perhaps we can stop extolling his brutality. Perhaps now is a good time to teach our children to pass over God, to be as unlike him as possible. And, if you want to be generous, you can look at this and say, okay, perhaps the intent of this article is to say, well, maybe we don't follow God of the Bible, right? Perhaps we don't follow God of the Jewish teachings, because perhaps this is an acknowledgement, but if so, it should have been worded this way. If so, he should have said, listen, I'm not making an attack on God himself. What I am saying is that these faiths, these religions, are faulted. They are bastardized by mankind. They're created by mankind. And while there are many things within each faith that are good guideposts, good bits of instruction that we should follow in our lives, and there are very good things to help us, find our way to God and through this life, that perhaps we need to, as a spiritual community, step back and reassess, reevaluate, and understand, how will people today in the modern times view these things, especially as we live in a world that nothing is hidden anymore. When I grew up as a kid in the 80s, the things going on in the Ukraine, the things that have happened all over Afghanistan, in Iraq, we wouldn't hear about, we'd hear about it in the news maybe, but you don't see the video, you don't see it in real time, you're not as aware of what goes on in this world. China, I know so much about China now, and I've spent time in China. I've spent time in Shanghai. I've spent time in Shenzhen. I've spent time in Hong Kong. It's a much smaller world these days, but China, I knew next to nothing about China. Now you can go anywhere and find out pretty much anything you want about the country and the people of the country. You can find out anything about any bit of information you want these days. And so we're inundated with all these things that are going on, but we're also much more educated about the world. And yes, there's a lot of false information out there, a lot of false education, but the information is there for us to process. And when you have a modern thinking person and a modern mind, that modern mind is going to look at a lot of this stuff and say, I do not buy into this. This is awful. Why would I want to follow this? So while I kind of get a point of what this individual is trying to say, I greatly disagree with the way in which he said it. Or at the very least, that yes, while he wraps up the article, and I'll get to that in a positive way of sorts, there's so much damage within the article and the way that it's expressed that helps nothing, and really contributes to the death of God, and unnecessarily so. It's guilt by association. You're literally making God guilty by the association of the bad people that have inappropriately used his name. And so anyway, after he says that we should be as unlike him as possible, the new quote says, and so God killed them all. The rabbis and priests and imams can preach to their classrooms. That was wrong, children. God threw Adam and Eve out of the Garden of Eden for eating an apple. They can caution their students. That's called being heavy-handed, children. Cursing all women for eternity because of Eve's choices. That's called objective punishment, children. They can warn the young, don't do that. Boo, the children will jeer. Again, in that article, though, in those little lines, he's saying what I just said. You're doing the same thing to God, right? Well, you're complaining about how all women would be cursed because of Eve's choices, as according to the Bible, and I would agree that that's, incorrect. But you're doing the same thing now to God. You are condemning God for all the bad choices of humanity and the things that we've chosen, because we are given free will. If anything, it shows God's a very accepting God. God's a very loving, very accepting God, because God gives us the ultimate in free speech. If it were, that's the big argument these days with the suppression of freedom of speech. He lets us say and do whatever we want to do. This is our Creator, who, yes, could literally step in at any time and stop anything, do anything. My very sermons that I put out here and my beliefs, if they were so awful and egregious and against God's will, he could strike me dead at any moment, and there's nothing I can do about that. It is what it is, and it would happen. He could stop it, but he doesn't, which is almost scarier to me in a way, because perhaps I am totally wrong. Perhaps in my attempt to understand my Creator, I am somehow betraying God. Perhaps God is the God of the Bible. And I'm in a lot of trouble if that's the case, because I pretty strongly, and will continue to pretty strongly, speak against so many of the things and the applications of faith. Because while I'm not against religion, I am against the malpractice of religion. I am against doing harmful things in the name of God, and I really am against any part of any faith that says that God is hateful, that God is vengeful, that God is jealous. These are human weaknesses. These are human things written into Scripture by humans and added by humans, either through their own weakness or through a misguided, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. Perhaps it started with a good intention to get people that perhaps were stubborn in accepting something and scaring them into accepting it, which is always a bad idea. Or, perhaps it was done for control. It's hard to say, but these are all things. These are all the manifestations. These are all the machinations and the creations of humans and humanity, not of God. God is a loving Creator, and God is different to everybody. What and who God is different to everybody. Okay? The core and the essence of what God is, I do think, is a shared value that we all must come to together to understand and realize. But God is not this evil creation. And I wish we would get more voices out there saying that. I wish places like the New York Times would do rebuttals of articles like this one and say, okay, well, this was this individual's idea, but here's someone else's idea. So he says he was raised strictly Orthodox, old school, SHTETL. I don't know that word. Fabulous. Every year at the beginning of the Seder, we welcomed in the hungry and the poor Jews who can't afford to have a Seder themselves. It's a wonderfully humane gesture. A few short hours of God later, at the end of Seder, we open the front door and call out to him, pour out thy wrath upon the nations that did not know you. Again, that's an interesting paragraph right there. And it kind of does, in a bit, encapsulate what I'm saying again about religion. So you look at this thing where they help people. It's a faith, the Jewish faith, bringing in people that are less fortunate, feeding them, doing something that shows great compassion, empathy, helping your fellow man. And that's what faith is about. That's what religion should be about. And that's what our God would want us to do, because it's a good thing. Take care of each other. Take care of your fellow man. But then finishing it with, pour out thy wrath upon the nations that did not know you. Well, that's a problem, right? Because that's man saying, if you don't know God, come on, God, strike him down. Teach him a lesson for not knowing you. It's much like in, I think it was my first or second episode that I had thrown up. I spoke about when I did comparative religions, and I read the Quran, and I read Islam for Dummies, great book, by the way. And I found myself saying, oh my gosh, I think I might be Muslim, right? Because I believe so much of that faith was just beautiful. And so much of it just made absolute sense to me. But then, there is, a part in there where, what's very interesting is, the Muslims accept all. Jesus is a prophet, Buddha is a prophet. Anybody that is taking you down a path to God is a prophet, and it's a good thing until you become aware of Muhammad. And once you're aware of Muhammad, you must accept and convert to the Muslim faith. Otherwise, it's not okay anymore. I'm in a nutshell. It's maybe a little more complex than that, and that's where one of the areas it lost me, because it went from very, very accepting to which is really what I believe. I don't care, what path you take to God and your Creator, as long as it's a noble path, and as long as it's a path of compassion and empathy and love and acceptance, and trying to do everything you can to better your fellow man and mankind. But it's a very interesting paragraph there that he just did, because it really, again, kind of, I think sometimes he skirts around an obvious truth, but he has a point that he wants to prove, and that is he has a vengeance against God right now, and he's taking an attack. He's attacking God with this information instead of saying the obvious, which is mankind is the problem. God's not the problem. And so he continues, and God does with plagues and floods, with fire and fury, and the young and old, the guilty and innocent. And we humans, made in his image, do the same, with fixed-wing bombers and cluster bombs, with self-propelled mortars and thermobaric rocket launchers. In quotes, why did God kill the firstborn cattle, my rabbi said. Because the Egyptians believed they were gods, was the answer. Killing gods is an idea I can get behind. That's his quote. And that is gods in lowercase g. And, most of you understand that. Typically, if you're speaking about the God, it's a capital G. If you're talking about idols and false gods and, theoretical things, it's usually a God with a lowercase g. And then he continues, this year at the end of Cedar, let's indeed throw our doors open to strangers, to people who aren't our own, to the terrifying them, to the evil others, those people who seem so different from us, those we think are our enemies, or who think us are theirs, but who, if they sat down around the table with us, we'd no doubt despise the Pharaohs of this world as much as we do, and who dream of the same damned thing as us all, which is peace. A beautiful way to end this thing, and I couldn't agree more. But again, that's the inflammatory rhetoric of the beginning part of being done with God, per se, because in the very end, he does wrap it up. It's the Pharaohs, or the false gods of our world today. The politicians are false gods of this world. The celebrities are the false gods of this world. These are people, the media, who spew out lies towards all of us. Those are the false gods of the world. These are people that control us, even at the great harm of humanity, even in inciting violence against one another, encouraging hatred amongst one another, encouraging us to split into different camps and segregate ourselves from one another, and discourage us from talking to one another to where we can understand, accept, and learn from one another. So in that case, yes, those gods in the lowercase g, I'm all for being rid of them as well. I won't say killing, because that could be misunderstood as the literal act of going out. No, but stopping the worship of these individuals who are just humans, who often are wildly faulted and often are very corrupt, or at least so blinded by their own self-image and their own self-worth that they feel the ability to come out and tell all of us normies, as they say, who live a normal life, that we're wrong and we should emulate them. So it's a very beautiful thing that he says. He goes, as we're sitting here helping people, instead of looking at people who are different from us, looking at people who we don't necessarily agree with, looking at, everybody as our enemies, let's be a brotherhood. Let's try to help each other. Let's work towards peace, stop killing each other, stop bombing each other. And from that, I can completely agree. So I really do think that this individual, what was his name again? Shalom, I believe is what his name was. Um, yeah, Shalom Auslander. You know, you really were on the cusp of something good here, right? But instead, you title this thing, "In a time of war, I propose we give up God," with a capital G. It could be that we give up our false gods, that we give up, and you really touch base on, look at all these good things that religion can do. Look at some of the teachings, though, that perhaps are misguided, and understand that it's not God, nor necessarily the faithful or faith, that's the problem. It's the following of these individuals, these pharaohs, right? Because let's face it, the leaders of the world, they are the pharaohs. The multi-millionaire celebrities that live in this lifestyle that none of us could ever even dream of, who sit down and tell us how we should live our lives while they're taking money from people who are killing people, while they're taking money from very corrupt sources and making themselves rich and living this comfortable life where they don't have to worry about any of the things that you and I have to worry about. Oh, yeah, tell us, well, like they say, you make it to the top and then pull up the ladder so we can't follow behind. And it's not that we'd want to follow by taking corrupt money and such, but it is living, they need us to be the plebes. They need us to be, the dead bodies that they can step on to climb up higher on the ladder. And that's what they do. So I can completely agree with Shalom in that we need to stop worshiping the Pharaohs. We need to stop worshiping the humans in power as if they're somehow better than the rest of us. No, they work for us, But let's not take this out on God. This is not a thing of God. These horrible atrocities that are happening, Vladimir Putin killing the Ukrainians, is not God. Unfortunately, it's like the argument with freedom of speech that's currently being waged in this world. You're either a free speech absolutist, where you say everybody can say what they need to say, and if there's consequences, there's consequences, but you should be allowed to say what you want to say. And then there's people that say, no, we need to censor speech, and we need to, be the arbiters of what's okay to say and what's not okay to say. Both of these things, both of these positions have problems. However, I would say the latter, being the censorship, is the slipperier of the slopes, because who tends to then dictate that narrative? Who decides what is real, what can be said, what speech is okay and what speech isn't okay? And that is whoever's in power. So if you want to look and say, okay, the left has gained a pretty good foothold, and the more radical left is in power now, and you agree with them at the moment, and so you like the censorship, just understand the pendulum swings both ways, and often speech is swings wildly both ways. And so right now it's far left. It's inevitably going to end up pretty far right. And when that does inevitably end up pretty far right, you're not going to like where it goes. We need to stop that pendulum and keep it in the middle. We need to do that through conversation, through sane reasoning with one another, through acceptance of each other's ideas, and finding that happy middle ground and that happy medium. We can't, any situation where any one group is too happy means it wasn't a good resolution. Both sides should come out of something feeling like they've really compromised and they didn't get 100% of what they wanted. And that's just the way life works, or should work at least. And so, what I would say to you, Mr. Auslander, is you missed an opportunity. Now you have people raging that you are a voice of the devil, and that what you're saying is evil, and the tendency is going to be to lean that way by many, because the way you went about it, right? Don't attack God. If you want to be critical of humanity, then be critical of humanity. If you want to be critical of those in power, let's be critical of those in power, but let's not go after God for our mistakes. God gives us free will, and we often, like petulant children, misbehave and mishandle the free will that we have. And it's time that the faithful and Mr. Auslander, it would appear that you were raised in a faithful environment. Look at your faith. Look at the parts of it that are beautiful and the parts of it that you wish to put out and portray. And like cedar, I think I'm pronouncing that correctly, sounds like a beautiful idea. And show people, hey, listen, here's my faith, here's what I was brought up to believe, but here's the parts of it that are beautiful, and let's focus on these things. And perhaps it's not time to kill God. It's not time to stop worshiping God. It's time to, instead of questioning our Creator's motives, let's question human motives. Let's look at the faith that was created by humanity and say, okay, here's what needs to change. Here's where we have to remove ourselves from this and stop condemning God for our actions. Let's take responsibility for what we have done wrong, and let's move forward. So that's enough of this for today. This really wasn't my intended topic I was going to get into. I'm going to start moving into some more philosophical things. That I'm in a weird position, and I do think I'm going to continue to be in a weird position if and when people ever start hearing what I have to say. Because I don't take either side. There's going to be people that are in the hardcore religious right that are going to be very upset with me. There'll be people in the far left that are very upset with me. And there's nothing I can do about that. All I can tell you is I believe in love of everyone, acceptance of everyone, the drive to try to understand one another and accept one another for who we are, the drive to try to be as inclusive as possible without alienating anybody, and insisting that everybody listen to one another. Even if you don't like what you have to hear, let's understand each other, so we stop looking at each other as enemies, and instead we start looking at each other as brothers and sisters in this world. And we find a way to make things better and live a godly life, the God as I see God. And hopefully you will find God one day. But my God is a loving God. My God's an accepting God. My God loves you no matter who, what you are. Even if you're wildly faulted and have made horrendous mistakes in your life, it doesn't mean there won't be consequences of some sort. We don't know. But what we do know is our children, I have two, love them no matter what. I can sure get upset with them sometimes, but no matter what they do, I still love them. And that's our God. So with that, I'm going to end this today, and hopefully get some feedback. I would love some feedback from everyone. I do have an email, livepositiveministries@gmail.com. I have started a Patreon. I haven't put it up anywhere yet because I'm still kind of setting that up. And, I feel weird, but it's like any ministry. I'm trying to do this and find time to do this while still surviving and paying my bills. And, if anybody does want to support my ministry until I kind of get that all set up, feel free to email me at livepositiveministries@gmail.com. We can try to figure something out until I can kind of get things set up. And any help anybody wishes to offer, even any kind of help that someone wishes to offer, any kind of input you would like to share, any conversations you would like to have, let's have them. I'm interested. I'm pretty technically challenged. You can see that. I'm not good at making thumbnails or editing my videos. I just do them, do my audio track, put a picture on it, a couple words, and that's what I post up because, that's about my skill set when it comes to these sort of things. But I thank you so much. Again, I'm Pastor Jason, and God bless everybody. Let's not hate on Mr. Auslander, but perhaps if you ever do get a chance to reach out to him, if you agree with what I said, maybe share this with him. Let's hear what he has to say. I'd even love to talk to him someday and share opinions. But God bless, be safe, and we'll talk to you in the next one.